And I'm hiding behind the camera. Get you some water. Hello. We're going to get started. So Jingari, hello, good afternoon everyone. It's a privilege to be here with you today for this presentation by Professor Rigney. My name is Leonie Rowan and I'm the Director of the Griffith Institute for Educational Research. Our institute is home to approximately 45 researchers and we've got one central goal, that's to ensure that the benefits which can flow from education and learning opportunities, wherever they take place, whenever in our lifetime they occur, can be genuinely experienced as respectful, positive, generative, and transformative for all of the diverse people in our world, including and especially those who've been minoritized and failed by the very people and systems who have the power to change lives. We welcome conversations with anyone who shares a similar commitment and is interested in working for educational change. Our institute members work on the unceded lands of Indigenous people, and regardless of where we are individually located, we gather today on what always was and always will be country of First Nations people. So I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of country throughout Australia, including those with us today, and recognise the continuing connection to lands, waters and communities. I offer my respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders' living cultures and to elders past and present. As director of an institute committed to the pursuit of social, educational, and political justice, I also accept my own immediate and ongoing responsibility to ensure that our work goes beyond these moments of acknowledgement. I promise ongoing and sincere investment in the work of reconciliation and accept both the possibility and the discomfort that comes from that journey. Our institute exists to learn, and I have made many personal mistakes in my own attempts to work towards reconciliation, and as director, and I owe a debt to those who have pointed out these mistakes and encouraged me to be better. Thank you, and I'll keep working on it. We are privileged to have relationships with local Indigenous elders whose generosity is matched only by their intellect and insight. And for our Welcome to Country today, I'm so pleased to introduce our newest GIER member, an amazing human being as well, Indigenous elder, Arnie Cantus Kruger. Please welcome.
Now, am I standing in a place that they can see me online as well?
Turn the camera around and you can see what they can see.
Okay. We will start with song. Wagga wagga mama, wagga wagga mama, yabron jiran jirun, yabron jiran jirun. Close your eyes as we welcome the spirits in. Wagga wagga mama, wagga wagga mama, yabron jiran jirun. Yamaron, jiran, jiran. The song you've just heard is a call to the spirits. So we say, wega wega mala, spirits, spirits, where are you? And then we call to the local spirits here on Kumameri country of the Yugambeh language region. We've called to Jabrin, the giant that lives in Burley Mountain, and we've called the spirits and invited it's time of the frost right now, Jiran Jinarin, and we've called the sun and we've called the frost in to give us a blessing and a welcome as we begin. Nanyanari Candace, my name is Candace. I'm a Kumameri Nugi woman of the Gold Coast and Moreton Island. My family are then in the Yugambeh and Quandamooka families and tribal groups. It is my pleasure to welcome our speaker here today. I am looking forward to learning so much from you, as is everyone else here, and I pay respects to Indigenous people that are here in this space and non-Indigenous people that are here to learn. And I'm going to actually now sing you a song that calls us to gather to be ready. So it's the Yawara. Yawara is the corroboree song where we all come and give. And it means you come here, all come ready for the corroboree, the time that we're going to gather right now. And I pay my respects to past, present, and those emerging, because when we talk about emerging elders, I know that that's what I am, an elder who has recently been gifted that title, an auntie by community, in recognition of the work that I do, but also in teaching everyone else about the fact that elders are emerging in community, elders are moving forward, and we acknowledge the elders that are past, and we have lost elders recently in community, and the present, those that are old, and those that are not quite so old, but are keepers of knowledge holders, which is where I sit today as songwoman in my community as a knowledge holder. And I turn and I'm looking forward to learning from others today as keepers of other knowledge that help us move forward in both spaces where we live and work and teach and play, where we keep culture alive, but we move forward in the community that we're in. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Candice. My role now is to introduce you, Irabina. Thank you so much, Candice. That was actually very, very moving. Welcome to country. Yes. Very much in awe of your talent. People online are welcome to you as well. You're welcome to turn on your cameras. If you could keep your microphones mute during the main part of the presentation, and then we would invite you to unmute your microphone and join in the conversation later. I'd like to give a shout out to Tamara. Hello, Tamara, a Bachelor of Education student who is, yep, we can see you there, Tamara. Thank you very much. Welcome, Tamara. It's really important to have our Bachelor of Education undergraduate students as part of these conversations, so thank you as well. I too acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land upon which we meet today and pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to Indigenous people who are present with us in the room today, but also Indigenous people who are online. So, Irabina, it gives me great pleasure to introduce you to the group that have come together here at Griffith University. For those of you who have been following Irabina's work for some time, you will know that he's had an enormous impact, not only on education, but also on people's uptake of Indigenous knowledges. I've always found Irabina to be a very generous soul. You're a very generous listener. You're very generous in your presence, and he's also very generous when he speaks. So thank you, Irabina. I've also found Irabina to have a very ferocious heart, especially when we're talking about matters that relate to children, that relate to culture, relate to diversity, and relate to equity. He's also got a very sharp mind. You will hear that he will bring together multiple theories to actually try and make sense of some things that are quite nonsensical in what we do in the name of teacher education. I won't read Irabina's very, very long list of esteemed achievements, but there are two that I'd like to especially mention. One is the recent appointment as OAM, and the other one is that he is on the scientific committee for Reggio Emilia. So I think both of those give us a sense of the esteem with which Irabina is held nationally, but also internationally. And we can see where his passions for curriculum, pedagogy and assessment all collide with this overarching agenda around helping our children to realise their political participation as they create the world that they're going to live in. So, Irabina, thank you so much for joining us today. I'll move out of the camera's way and let you present to us.
Thank you very much. Very honoured with that introduction, Beryl. You're someone I hold in high regard, and we've been working together now for some time on a book, which will be out shortly. And so I was passing this way, and I was hoping to try and catch up with Professor Rowan around the Griffith Institute for Educational Research and our links with the Centre for Research in Education and Social Inclusion at Flinders, because both of our goals are pretty much similar. So we have prolific scholars in our centre, and we're wanting to try and get closer to your centre because we think we can do some really terrific things together. So hence that's why I'm here. Nina mani mayu lejatika min manyanga porka nankada miuna ngaichalia yukunaria da yakunundalia marina budni maregula pinguna yijarevani ngacha yunga da yakunundala Candice nani kumba colleagues, I would like to acknowledge the country that I'm on. I acknowledge the Yugambeh sovereignty and its unceded sovereignty of its children and its elders and its community. And just deeply moved by your acknowledgement and welcome to country today. Language is always critical, and so yeah, it's really powerful when I hear language. So thank you so much. It's very, very honoured. I'd like to thank the organisers. When I wrote to Beryl and said, and to Greg, I'm up this way. Can we at least get a coffee together? And then, it's really nice that you invited me to speak for a little while. So just like to thank the organisers. Thank the people for setting up. Thanks, Rachel, for setting up the YouTube. I'd like to welcome everybody online. My title of the paper today is hopefully only going to go for 30 minutes, and then we're going to try and have some conversation. And that is the future implications of a culturally responsive pedagogy in Australia. And but look, there's some powerful scholars in your research institute that I'd like to acknowledge. I mean, there's some famous people around the table. So Beryl, Professor Singh is not here, but I'd like to acknowledge her. Dr. Chris Wilson, who's around, I've already spoken about. Dr. Gregory Vass's work. Dr. Deb Bagali, who is doing some amazing work. Dr. Susan Wadham, who both her and I go back for a long way. Deputy Stephen Hodges, someone who I've read. And again, Leonie, thanks for having me. It's great. So what I'm really interested in trying to do today is to try and bring some ideas of our ARC grants, some of the findings of our 3 ARC grants at the moment on culturally responsive pedagogy that we've had over the time, and some of our CAT 2 grants that we've been doing in some of the poorer suburbs in the north and south of Adelaide. And I do this because I think there's some serious questions that's being asked. At the moment, we've got around about 7 billion people on the planet. By 2050, there's going to be 10 billion people on the planet. 1/3 of that 10 billion people on the planet will be children. And at the moment, in the 7 billion that we do have, around about 200 million children, although it's gone up according to UNICEF figures, around about 200 million children around the world are out of school. And that school is failing children around the world. If it's roughly around 200 million children that are out of school at the moment, we anticipate by 2050, when the world's population is 10 billion, we're expecting it to double or triple. And we know that the majority of Indigenous education are in that 200 million out of school. So what's the purpose of education on a single planet when there's 10 billion people have to learn how to live here and live together? So we've got some work to go do. If school is failing the 7 million, with children in the 7 billion planet, what will it look like in 2050 when we hit 10 billion? So it comes back to sort of, those old questions of John Dewey and, Lev Vygotsky, going even further back to them about Freud and Piaget. The key question is, what is the purpose of schooling and teacher education for that matter? And how fast is our teacher education keeping up with the changing human condition of the child? Childhoods are absolutely modern and they change constantly. And the key thing is, how does our theories keep up with that modernity of the modern childhood condition, human condition. So, so if you're thinking about decolonizing your curriculum and wondering where to start, particularly in the Pacific, which is home to some of the worst education systems in the world, don't worry, you're in the majority. Lots of people, lots of countries around the world are wanting to look at how we democratize, how we humanize, and particularly how we decolonize. And I'm a bit suspicious of the decolonial theoretical movement at the moment. There's a lot of some serious aspects of under theorizing going on here. So, but if you're serious about trying to look at education from these many different ideas, many people are supportive of the idea in principle, but really aren't sure what to do. And so I'm offering culturally responsive pedagogy as a way to take us forward in that space. And we have 10 years of data with teachers, leaders, and super diverse learners. So Freire, in the Pedagogy of the Oppressed, argued that it's not enough. It's not enough to create meaningful curriculum to improve disparity of minority children, particularly those from disadvantaged backgrounds. So when Freire was writing, we sort of, and we understood this is that it's not enough just to improve curriculum, and that we need teachers trained to enact responsive pedagogies, that there's this pedagogical divide and a deep pedagogical gap that needs to be pursued. And so pedagogies that link to the cultural and linguistic intelligences of all children are really, really critical. And this is how Freire should be read in the Pedagogy of the Oppressed. In other words, creating more diverse and inclusive children's books, inclusive curriculum, are not enough to shift inequality without a teacher trained to use them in conjunction with culturally responsive pedagogies. It's simply not enough. We know this. We've got literature to suggest that this has been happening for a while. It's the investment into a national curriculum in the sense that it would solve some of our closing the gap problems. It clearly hasn't. And there is an international body of evidence that reports that teachers are challenged by rapid diversification of national populations due to war, poverty, pandemics, climate change, and transmigration. And so there's a serious concern about how schools and early year learnings in Australia, particularly the United States and the United Kingdom, is becoming ever more de-democratized places by a growing preoccupation with formalized basic literacy instruction, the rise of the literacy commercial packages as one size fits all, and the rise of the nationalistic monocultural homogeneity. What we're seeing in countries that look like us and sound like us, in particularly the United States, the UK, Europe, and the Pacific, is the authoritarian shift by government authorities and its impact on pedagogy and curriculum, particularly leadership in schools. We know, from Lisa Delpit's work early that, the child has to develop the codes of power to be Australian in Australia. But if Lisa Delpit also argues that the codes of power for the Aboriginal learner to be Aboriginal. So the Aboriginal learner needs, or the minority learner needs the codes of power to be Australian, but they also need the codes of power to leave the school with their Aboriginality intact. And so settler grammar only literacy inhibits the Aboriginal learner from being Aboriginal. Settler grammar that focuses on the concept of building the children's rights in only one form of epistemology ontology is axiologically flawed. And so we go back to Delpit, we go back to Freire, and we know that whilst standardised assessments for high stakes accountability is quite interesting, Pauline Harris's work is suggesting at the moment that it's stifling pedagogical innovation, and that the teacher now is teaching to the test and moving away from knowledge plurality or identity belonging. And so Pauline Harris's early work, if you don't know Pauline Harris, my colleague who works in the literacy fields, Beryl, and I have got Pauline in one of our chapters in our book. She's quite concerned about the notion of the de-democratizing rise of the de-democratized school. And in this is that the humanness, as Freire talks about, is being removed in terms of a dehumanized education system where the child isn't learning about who they are. So in such a climate, the positioning of early childhood teachers and teachers for that matter, positioning these teachers work away from knowledge plurality constrains teachers' practices to affirm diverse children's rights and the agency of the human bonds that they need to learn that are necessary to enact their democratic participation. And so, look, I haven't been saying this. I've been saying this for a while. Greg's been saying this for a while. Other Aboriginal scholars like Peter Anderson, Bronwyn Fredericks, and Debbie's work as well, Melita Hogarth, Veronica Arbin has been saying this for a while. A young scholars whose work I've just read at the moment, her thesis is just passed, called Michaela King, who's writing about weaving pedagogy and curriculum together. So in this presentation, in this short presentation, I'm arguing socializing children into multiliteracies and plurality of knowledges draws upon their cultural intelligences for coexistence with humanity and the planet is the work of inclusive democracy. And that if the child isn't getting their democratic rights not met in school, or being taught how to receive or benefit their democratic rights, it's not the child's fault. It's a fault of democracy that the child isn't getting their democratic rights taught to them of how to enact them. So in this presentation, what I want to do really quickly is report on the Australian Research Council funded project titled Towards a Culturally Responsive Pedagogy that contains a nest of projects. We've been investigating and developing with my research teams the enactment of culturally responsive pedagogies in the previous iteration called with 7 Australian public schools, 4 preschools, 20 teachers, 7 principals serving over 360 Indigenous communities and over 1,000 diverse student cohorts. We're now working with 4 schools in our latest ARC grant, working with what a culturally responsive leadership looks like as a whole school approach to pedagogy. So what's the problem? As researchers, we came together applying for these ARC grants. I brought CRP to University of SA from Flinders, where I was working for 20 years. And as researchers, when I developed these research teams at Uni SA, we were deeply concerned by the overwhelming evidence that the urgent school reform was needed in Australia. One was for the appalling outcomes of school for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children. The second one was that the Australian and literacy standards for all children, according to the Productivity Commission, is well below the OECD average. So we're not getting it right for all kids. The third sort of rationale that we were working with was that Australian education is one of the most unequal in the OECD. Just let that sink in at the moment. So even back in 2016, we knew that economic inequality was the largest it's ever been in the history of Australia. We knew that there was a correlation to education. So it has now in Australian education, like most of the education systems in the Pacific, is one of the most unequal in OECD. And we also know from NSEF research that shows poor immigrants and refugee children continue to be disfranchised by mainstream schooling. The three rationales for our project was our starting point was we were advocating for pedagogical redesign by teachers in emergent multilingual children, especially with communities that were super diverse, what we're calling super diverse. So our three solutions were respond to the appalling educational outcomes by school for Aboriginal children, that there was this emergence of super diversity, that all classrooms in Australia, no matter where you are now, according to the literature, that there are mini United Nations in every classroom. And so we're provocating that the term super diversity, that's moving beyond multiculturalism theories around how you teach pedagogy for these classrooms. And then we were trying to sort of fish for a decolonizing, we were trying and go for a modern diagnosis of the ongoing colonial position, educational position. And apart from Debs and a few others, they're very, very under-theorised in Australia about the modern diagnosis of the Australian ongoing colonial condition, particularly pedagogically. So the appalling outcomes for Aboriginal children. Well, the COAG report, even the latest one, saying the gaps in closing the gap for Aboriginal children aren't closing. For example, as you would know, in the Aboriginal Year 3 data, they remain well below the national reading, almost 20%. In some states, they're out to 40%, like Northern Territory. The need to respond to superdiversity. Well, the Human Rights Australian report says 1 in 2 have an overseas parent, 1 in 4 were born overseas, and the UNICEF research shows that multilingual immigrants and refugee children are struggling in Australian schools. So superdiversity, as we argue, is the new normal. What's your pedagogy doing about it? So we're suggesting that classrooms resemble mini United Nations, and there's a high teacher demand in South Australia in the schools that we're working with for pedagogy to meet the need of the super diverse learner that walks into class, and that the rapid diversification of diversity since the end of the Cold War has really contributed to new theories that's beyond old multiculturalism. So Indigenous immigrant families' differences across class, gender, sexuality, non-binary, climate and refugees, digital diversity, disability, religiosity, foreign-born immigrants, student and refugees are this new definition of superdiversity. We're drawing on Lee Gulfang's current work on superdiversity and the superdiverse learner. We think that hers is a better fit than Veritek's arguments from Britain and how London became superdiverse in the last 20 years under the EU rule. Gulfang Lee's work is now suggesting that there's diversity in diversity and that our pedagogies are missing this. So the Aboriginal learner that walks into class is from a parent that's most probably married, is Aboriginal and is married to somebody who's possibly a climate refugee, can speak 3 languages other than English, and is most probably Muslim. And so we've also, who possibly could have a disability. So the diverse learner is occupying more diversity inside diversity is Gulfang Lee's thesis. And we think that that's an important argument for us. And that Aboriginal children have always been super diverse in terms of their cultural and linguistic repertoire prior to colonisation. But superdiversity theory is attempting to think past old thinking of multiculturalism. And the reason why it's so prominent is because it looks so different to multiculturalism. It's far more rapid in growth than the old multiculturalism. And in doing so, the high demand of teachers for superdiverse pedagogies or pedagogies to deal with the superdiverse learner is upon us. And therefore, old versions of multiculturalism that just deal with the settler child, the Aboriginal learner, and the immigrant is now moved to the refugee, the climate refugee, the digital native. And so we have to come up with new terms to begin to try and theorise the modern superdiverse learner. Decolonisation, well, it means different things to different people. So we thought we'd have a go at this in this ARC grant. Although we're very frustrated with where the theoretical literature edge is at the moment. Although decolonisation means different things to different people in different contexts, it can be broadly understood through the works of Mignolo and Andretti as an umbrella term for three different aims. Most of Indigenous scholars who are writing in this space have the similar three aims. It's to resist colonisation and assimilation to homogenising subjects. The second aspect is to enact some sort of transformation. And then the third is to create and keep alive modes of knowing, being, and relation. And so when Candice is talking about, song pedagogy, she's also talking, when she sings, she's also talking about, pedagogies of, singing literacies. In my community, we have saltwater literacies, we have freshwater literacies, we have fish literacies, and lots of teachers come to our mission not knowing these intelligences, and that it's up to our community to educate them because they're the ones with the gap coming into our community. So we have to constantly ontologize them constantly before they begin to take up their positions. So a culturally responsive pedagogy as a form of decolonial critical pedagogy, we refer to them as humanising pedagogies. And again, humanising pedagogies has its roots in Freire's notion of in the pedagogy of the oppressed, but Freire's notion of humanising pedagogies. And it focuses, according to Freire, to the pursuit of one's agency for humanity as a counter practice to unsettle, dehumanizing education. And so when you read Salazar's work, who's drawing on the works of Freire, Salazar goes back to Foucault's, the theories of discourse and power in archaeology of knowledge. But Salazar's going deep as Marie Salazar, who's a Latino. She's going back into saying that if a pedagogy isolates the child from their relational ontology, epistemology, and axiology, it means that it's a dehumanizing aspect, and that education for the superdiverse learner is constantly an endless pursuit to preserve their humanity. And the only way that you can preserve it is to make sure that Ngunnawal kids have their language and that they also have codes of power, as Delpit talks about, to numeracy and literacy in English. And that this, when they're both together in unison, these are a humanizing pedagogy. And so we see, borrowing from Salazar and who draws upon Foucault, pedagogy of the oppressed from Freire. We're talking about an element where the child is not being dehumanized, and they become dehumanized when all you're chasing for in your pedagogy is cognition. Cognition is an important part of humanity's humanness. But ontology and axiology are just as critically important than epistemology. And so these are critical work for the superdiverse learner teacher, going back to Lev Vygotsky, is that in order to get the zone of proximal development happening, there needs to be epistemology, ontology, and axiology from both codes of power the child is bringing, both their Australianness and their Aboriginalness, and they need to be coming together in that zone of proximal development, or else the ultimate is dehumanizing. And so the ultimate dehumanization is projecting Western learner identities in settler grammar only onto linguistically diverse Aboriginal learners. And when we project these learner identities onto the diverse learner that walks into class. When we project these settler learner identities onto these super diverse learners, although the settler learner is also super diverse, that's what we're arguing. So therefore, we have to be very mindful that the projection, what's doing the projection is our pedagogies, not necessarily our personalities. Now, race theorists might have some, issues with this, but we're suggesting that our pedagogies are not fit for purpose if they're projecting learner identities onto those who don't come from the dominant identity. So to be clear, cultural responsive pedagogies is theorized, as we argue, as a form of human pedagogy, in a sense that it pays attention to the contextual and situational experiences of the student or the learner as a human being, and recognizes that pedagogy is ultimately linked to power, politics, history, and culture. And so the datification of the child in settler grammar, we argue, isolates the learner from elements of their humanity, and that it needs to get closer to their humanity for the education system to be relevant. And so in Salazar's argument, the idea of reinventing pedagogy is the necessary work. And so we're engaging in that necessary work. So to be clear, decolonization of the curriculum doesn't mean losing traditional texts. It's not meaning throw out Shakespeare. Instead, we're suggesting a humanized, humanized, decolonized curriculum argues for multi-literacies, plurivocal, plurilingual, multiple knowledges, pluri-knowledges, structures, curriculum, pedagogies, and teacher resources. It's not, our version of decolonization is not meaning replacing black curriculum with white curriculum. We're arguing for pluri-literacies and multiple knowledges and multiple literacies. And so cultural responsive pedagogy, when used effectively by teachers, can address the hierarchies of knowledge, we argue, we've got the evidence to prove it, that are argued by decolonization theorists like Gramsci, Said, Magnolo, and particularly Andretti. So we're suggesting that when teachers do uptake, we've got evidence to say when culturally responsive pedagogies are enacted by teachers effectively through a professional development mechanism, it can address hierarchies of knowledge in schools, as argued the necessary need to by the decolonial theorists like Gramsci and Said. But particularly we're drawing on, again, Dewey, Vygotsky and Lawrence Malaguzzi from the Reggio Emilia. So why CRP? Well, there's a growing body of evidence that cultural responsive pedagogies do improve academic success. There is cultural responsive pedagogies that are going for numeracy and literacy improvement alone. And then there are other cultural responsive pedagogies that are going for cognition as well as the whole of the child. And unfortunately, the theory and practice of cultural responsive pedagogies, other than our work and Greg's and others, are only weakly developed in Australia. And there are very few significant peer evaluation reviews. Our team has produced the largest literature review, an updated literature review, and you can download it free online. There is no paywall on that. So just type in cultural responsive pedagogies. It comes from our research centre, and we have a mandate that we don't put a paywall in front of our research. There's also a cultural responsive pedagogies website that we've created, free for all teachers around Australia. So why CRP? What is CRP? Well, our research defined the term as cultural responsive pedagogy refers to those pedagogies that activate, value, mobilise as a resource the cultural repertoire and linguistic intelligences that the student brings to class, to the relationship. It's based on Gladstone Billings' work with African Americans, Geneva Gray with Native Americans, Russell Bishop's in the Pacific with Māori, Castagno and Brayboy with Native Americans, Joanne Archibald's work with First Nation, Canadian, and so on. So CRP has developed out of the critiques of deficit views of disadvantage to explain differences. And in doing so, the deficit view of the superdiverse learner are really, really prominent on trying to critique these explanations of differences, particularly in the child development literature. And so any aspect in the child development literature that talks to deficit needs to be countered. So CRP research instead poses an asset-based approach to curriculum and pedagogy, and our project constructed an Australian version of CRP that examined how teachers validate and extend children's cultural and linguistic repertoire. And these included moving beyond the one-size-fits-all learning modalities towards differentiation, taking seriously the home orality, experience of affect and funds of knowledge young children bring into school, connecting life worlds, the child's life worlds and their home oral communication to preschool print literacies and phonemic awareness. And we're working on pedagogies that view all learners as competent and intelligent beings, and that they come from competent and intelligent Aboriginal communities. So we see all children as intelligent, and we think that what is needed with the superdiverse learner is the teacher to enact a dialogic and constructivist informed teaching practices. So the 5 findings that we've found in this research project to redesign curriculum and pedagogy based on the evidence of the teacher action research and the student surveys that we did with our colleagues. These are the 5 points that we gave teachers. So to redesign your curriculum, you need to provide high intellectual challenge for the child, because just doing non-high intellectual challenge to the Aboriginal learner is just doing things to the Aboriginal learner that parents don't want. So we suggest that they're providing high intellectual challenge, being a strong demander or a friendly demander at the rate of the learner is a critically important step for Aboriginal education, let alone culturally responsive pedagogies. So high intellectual challenge is a critical part of our cultural responsive pedagogy. We also think that curriculum needs to be connected strongly to the student life worlds, and that they become, because they're the experts of their own life worlds, they are the researchers. So the classroom becomes a place where they can research their own life worlds and linking that to the curriculum and their assessment. So I've just written a piece called Seeing the Aboriginal Learner as Knowledge Producer. So most times, most teachers see the Aboriginal learner as a knowledge consumer. And it's my view that Aboriginal child has always produced knowledge for their community for thousands of years. I mean, if you know your knowledge, you need to thank the child that was your parent for gaining that knowledge during childhood. So when we want to connect strongly to student as life world, we must see Aboriginal learners as knowledge producers, not just knowledge consumers, and that they come to class with these life worlds, and we need to connect the curriculum to what they bring, not what they don't have. The third point was recognise cultural difference as a positive asset and ensuring, so we said to these teachers, how do you ensure that all students get the opportunity to feel positive about themselves in the classroom, about their own identity? So how do you see what they're bringing to class in their cultural and linguistic intelligences as positive assets for learning? Because if you see them as deficit, your pedagogy is according. Then our fourth point was that the student needs to perform learning for an audience other than the teacher. That whilst the child was producing knowledge for the teacher, if they're the researchers of their own life world, some of the knowledge they're producing is for the community. And so the student should get opportunity to perform their learning for other people other than the teacher in their communities, in the shopping malls, in the on the beaches, in the streets, where their local community, black or white, can see what these children are doing for their local community. We also found that most super diverse learners are very, very good at multimodal literacies. And so we asked the teachers to try and use digital techniques. And this picks up some of Troy's theses that he's just finished and passed. So we're looking forward to the book when Troy publishes that. But so we've got some of in our writing. So Troy, you could mine that archive in looking at how a culturally responsive digital literacy looks like. And then lastly, taking a criticalist or an activist orientation. How do we get children to defend the knowledges that they're learning? So, you know, if we're teaching, the language that Candice has taught us this morning in a school, how do we get children to take this up as defending that language in their identities and their vocabularies? And so how do you get children to take up this level? The river down, good morning class, the river down here is polluted. We want you to go home and ask Nonu or Nonna, grandma or grandpa, elders, if they've ever drunk from this river. Can you all go home? And so the Greek Australian walks in, the Muslim walks in, the Aboriginal learner walks into class, and they've all got stories about rivers, right? And so we're trying to get this, the sort of the critical thinking, but also that an activist orientation where the child becomes the defender of the river's rights, as well as their own rights to live free in an area where the river isn't polluted. So cultural responsive pedagogy. What did the data say to us? So when we interviewed our teachers, what did they say? Well, the teachers did improve in taking notice and acknowledging the undeniable array of talent in the local Aboriginal community when they started seeing children as non-deficit. So when we tried to get them to start to see the child as a knowledge producer instead of a knowledge consumer for the community, their local community, black or white, they then started to see not only the child as their child's agency, but the community's agency, and they didn't totally stop seeing them as deficit, but they came to this idea that my classroom can produce knowledge that could benefit this community, and the child is central to that. The second point is that we tried to shift them to seeing schools as knowledge producers, the knowledge producing school for the community, rather than it's sometimes the greatest infrastructure in a community, black or white, the school. And if it's not producing school knowledge for the community, some instances you can go to the local school and the local science teacher has 10 years of data because she's taken the kids down to the river and measured it, and now has 10 years of data on how polluted the river is because the kids have produced the knowledge. So knowledge producing schools. That we at the end of the 3-year ARC grant, teachers started to see their school as knowledge producing for the community, not just for their assessment. We also see that the teachers disadvantage, that teaching disadvantaged super diverse classrooms are challenging and urgent. All of the teachers told us how challenging it was. It's difficult work to teach a super diverse classroom. Generally what happens is a teacher has 6 or 7 pedagogies, less than that if you believe the literature at the moment coming from some of the key journals in the world. Roughly, teachers have 3 pedagogies. And when they walk into a super diverse classroom, they try and fit these pedagogies as default pedagogies. And if they don't work, they give up, unless they're professionally developed to other ways. So what we found from our teachers was cultural responsive pedagogies was challenging. It was not always successful. However, it was urgent. And that they weren't getting it professionally developed when they're walking into a super diverse classroom. We also found that it proved levels of intentional and relational pedagogy. We also found high evidence of failure of cultural competency, and that we've got 3 years of data that we're just cleaning at the moment before we publish it, because this is quite contentious. Most Department of Education around the country uses cultural competency frameworks. Even my university uses it. And we know from our teachers, almost all of our teachers, suggest that it's an impossible bargain. This is their word. That's what came from the transcripts. This impossible bargain whereby the teacher has to be competent to 100% in all of the super diverse languages and cultures that walk into classroom. And they found, they also used this word constantly of, they felt paralyzed. This paralysis comes over them when they walk into a super diverse classroom. And pedagogically, paralyzation causes them to revert back to the default 3 pedagogies that they've got. So this impossible bargain gives us, and this sense of paralysis, that teachers cannot, it's impossible for teachers to be competent to 100% of all cultures inside the classroom. And so cultural competency that requests that and suggests that as a productive pedagogy is absolutely flawed. And that the teacher simply cannot be assessed or measured or held accountable to being some sort of, it's so nebulous in terms of some of the Likert scales that we would question some of these, and we're publishing it in one of the Q1 journals in the United States at the moment around the failure of cultural competency, and that it's time for our education systems to pivot to a more way in which that instead of the teacher being PD'd into trying to be 100% in every of the diverse cultures and languages and linguistic intelligences in the classroom, cultural responsive pedagogy pivots away from that to we're asking the teacher to construct the learning environment and allow the child to bring their cultural and linguistic intelligences to the event. So, the sort of the habitus of the teacher in terms of Bourdieuian theory is the notion of the event, the pedagogical event, is the place by which the teacher learns about the life world of the child, and allowing that it sets up the learning event so that the child brings their life worlds to it and expertise, and the teacher learns from that, rather than trying some sort of nebulous, unsophisticated way of being culturally competent. It's teachers setting the learning environment pedagogically to capture, validate, build, and then bridge to the curriculum their life worlds. That's the clear distinction between our work and cultural competency. And then we also found when we did this that there was a high level of opportunity for reflective practice by our teachers. They became, because we were using an action research model as PD, they would trial our principles of CRP, and if it didn't work, they would retrial it again and find a whole new set of new ways. One of the difficulties that we've also got in Australia, unlike other countries, we've got a homogenous workforce, but a super diverse learner. And this creates complexity when cultural responsive pedagogy is working with a homogenous workforce. Some argue that if the learner is super diverse, as Li Gufang says, shouldn't the workforce be? We're suggesting in settler societies this isn't the case. And so we've got some work to do around the workforce, the teacher workforce, and what this looks like. We also found anecdotally that lots of the diverse work was being not done in the 90% of the pedagogical datification. We were finding that the diverse work was being done in the 10% of teacher autonomy. Now, if the work, pedagogical work for superdiversity is being done in hidden curriculum or hidden leadership, and not done in the work that the teacher is being paid for, this is really difficult to shift from didactic teaching to dialogic. Didactic is just doing education to the child, and dialogic is in dialogue with the child about to give them a sense of ownership of their own learning. So we found that where does the heavy lifting of pedagogies for the super diverse learner happen? Is it happening in the hidden curriculum or the teacher autonomy? Why isn't it happening in the mainstream curriculum is understandable, because the cross-curriculum priorities aren't compulsory, they don't need to be assessed, and they only get done when the teachers has some time. So why wouldn't it be a correlation that any diverse work for the diverse learner is happening in the hidden curriculum or in the teacher's autonomy rather than what the teachers are being paid for to do? So we're still fleshing some of that anecdotal evidence out to try and see what we've got. So engaging teachers as researchers of their own practice and action research, we turned the teachers into ethnographers of the children's talents, like Louis Molle's work in Funds of Knowledge. Louis Molle, South America, or in Latino communities in the United States, schools hired ethnographers. Ethnographers went into the community, interviewed the Latino community, and found that these kids were coming from home to school with all of these knowledges. They were candle makers, they were farmers, they were doing Pythagoras in the fields. They were multiplying and subtracting constantly. They were laundry technicians. They were doing catering. They were ordering food. All these children in the spare time. And so all of these skills, according to Louis Molle, brought it to the school. The ethnographer brought it to the school, shown it up on a PowerPoint, and says, here's all the skills and talents that your child from these diverse backgrounds are bringing from home to your class. How are you connecting the curriculum to that? So, when we can't afford ethnographers to do this, like Louis Molle. So we're not whilst we're grafting onto funds of knowledge like Molle's work and Gutierrez and so on, we're not asking the teachers to become ethnographers because we don't have enough money in the system. And the teachers are so busy doing NAPLAN results that they don't get time to do anything else anyway. So how do you collate data about the child, that these diverse learners and their intelligences, so you can connect it to the curriculum in your classroom that they're bringing from home? So what we're doing is using the pedagogical event, back to Bourdieuian theory in terms of the sort of notion of habitus, around the teacher's habitus, is that we're trying to get the teacher to become ethnographer of the children's talents and prior knowledges. And once they've gathered them through the pedagogical learning event that they construct, they then connect that to the curriculum under a cultural responsive pedagogy banner. And so engaging students, we've turned these teachers into engaging students as researchers and linguistic ethnographers of their own cultures. They research their own life worlds, and they're connecting that to the curriculum. Good morning, class. We've got a problem. We've got that river that runs alongside the school is polluted and none of our community can drink from them. What are we going to do? Can you go home and interview your family whether you've ever drunk from this river, or if you've ever drunk freely from a stream without getting sick, anywhere else in the world from your family backgrounds? Once you've done that, we will collate that data. We want you to present it at the morning talk, and then we're going to write it into a paper as a part of your assessment as a literacy recount. You can film it by your phone. You can do the interviews. Good morning, researchers. We've got a problem. There's not enough buses taking us to the hospital in this community. What are we going to do about it? Can you go home and ask? See how this works. So enhancing learning by building on the children's cultural and linguistic repertoire is an old idea. However, child as knowledge producer and school as knowledge producer begins to add new flavour. So what are the key take-home messages into conclusion? Explicit connecting curriculum and pedagogy to students' cultural strengths is an instructional reform opportunity. The way in which the teacher validates and affirms the knowledge and linguistic intelligences of the superdiverse learner, or the Aboriginal learner in this instance, and then builds and bridges their local knowledges to global knowledges through the curriculum, is a critical instructional reform opportunity that shouldn't be missed at this hour. That didactive, reductive pedagogy that's just doing education to the children to get through to a NAPLAN score constrains Indigenous listenings and talents. And that cultural responsive pedagogy practices offers educational change through a decolonising frame of humanisation, using instructional dimensions of relational and dialogical teaching. What do we need to know more about? So we finish these 2 years, you'll finish these 2 ARC grants soon. What's still our blind spots? And I thought I'd put a couple down for you. The first one is that can the Aboriginal learner even exist or access in preschool when the birth certificate of the nation, the Australian Constitution, doesn't even recognise their education, their talents or their rights? So can the Aboriginal learner ever access a democratic, inclusive right to education when the Constitution doesn't even recognise them? And so this would be a question towards the non-educators, either online or our policy advisors, that if your Constitution has amnesia, so is your pedagogy. We don't know the effects of the Constitution on the intelligences of Australian children. Not much research has ever been done on the correlation. What we need to know, we need to take seriously the pedagogical challenges of the local sites of directors, school principals and teachers and pedagogical leaders at the site. At the moment, school sites have lost the ability to control their pedagogical needs for the challenges that they're having at the local site. And that pedagogy is being done to schools. We're yet to see what the consequences are for this. When a government body or the federation that suggests that our state governments decide that pedagogy and the curriculum and PD has been moved from the local site and the local state to the national curriculum. The national curriculum decides the curriculum. The NAPLAN decides its measurement, and it determines the pedagogy, not the local site. And that we're not really sure what complications this has for the local site at the moment. Let alone, we need to take seriously the amount of stress in our system at the moment because of the pandemic. And to clearly call what it is. That is that it's face-to-face learning pushed online and not call it digital education or digital learning, because it's simply not a digital pedagogical exercise. It was in a rush, and we're 3 years in, and we've got 3 years of Australian children graduating from a face-to-face online, face-to-face learning that was pushed online. What else do we need to know? We need to know more about the diversity in child rearing practices at the moment in Australian schools. I'll give you an example. Non-binary children, parents of non-binary children are asking teachers to read to their children children's books with non-binary characters. what happens when a non-binary child gets read a children's book with male and female characters constantly? And these, in terms of the superdiversity that's walking into class, are very, very critical. Need to understand the local modern childhood condition of the Australian learner at the moment, which we're arguing has shifted since the Cold War, is well beyond multicultural thinking, and now needs to understand just how many children aren't in school across Australia and what our pedagogies are doing, let alone those ones inside school. And lastly, I think we need to return to equality, how we define a quality early childhood education system to be, and what are the major inhibitors to all children gaining access to a quality early childhood education, given that the sector from 0 to 6 has been privatised. And this, in its high privatised state, has had some enormous dilemmas for the publicness of 0 to 6 education, particularly childcare, where childcare is a way of making the state money. And I think instead of the 0 to the early childhood area in the 0 to 6 category, instead of them being seen as teachers, they're seen as babysitters. And I think that more research needs to be looking at. So basically, in conclusion, my colleagues and friends, cultural responsive pedagogy as decoloniality implies praxis as identifying the epistemological, ethical, ontological, hegemonic structures that exist for childhood education and enabling access to a range of pedagogical knowledges, demanding that the need to pay attention to the rise of the superdiverse learner, and that a culturally inclusive curriculum is not enough. Rather, pedagogies as processes, practices, and paths of struggle that oppose ongoing dehumanization and de-democratization of education is the very basis in which children are needed to reclaim their humanity beyond its colonial legacies. So I guess it's fitting that I leave the last word to Freire, who states the solution is not to integrate the oppressed into the structures of oppression, but to transform the structures so that they can become beings for themselves and beings for the planet. Should the child inherit a dead planet? Well, that depends on the humanity of our pedagogies. Thank you very much.